one, action.
Okay, if you could just say who you are and like a little bit of your background and where you came from and maybe some issues that you had to deal with growing up.
First, let me thank you for inviting me here today. This is my old alma mater school. But also, I still live here in Mount Jackson, and I still go out and do community speeches whenever I'm asked to. And my name is Delois Nancy Lee Bullet Warr. Some of you might laugh and find that name kind of weird, because my name was Bullet first, and now I'm Warr. I grew up here in Mount Jackson, where I still live. I'm only about 500 feet from where I grew up at. And I went to school in Shenandoah County. I lived in Mount Jackson all my life, but I went to school in Woodstock, Virginia, because the schools were desegregated. They were segregated at the time. And then I went to high school in Rockingham County, and I came to Stonewall my senior year. That's when they desegregated the schools.
All right.
I have 5 children. My 5 children all went to school here and graduated here and have left the area.
Did you ever have any like issues with your children, like rebel flag? 'Cause I know they had a rebel flag in the old gym. Like, did you ever have any issues with that being here or anything like that?
No, I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't remember one being here, because my children and I, when I came here, it was only my brother and I and maybe 3 others. And we got along fine.
All right.
We had no problems at all. It's because we were raised in Mount Jackson and Newmarket, and all our life we played with white children. So there wasn't anything any different when we walked in that school door out there.
All right. What does the rebel flag mean to you? Does it have a meaning?
I don't, it doesn't mean anything to me, and I care really less about it. And I've heard a lot about the true meaning of the rebel flag. I think that the Caucasian people take it to the extreme about the rebel flag, because we don't hear anything bad about it. And if we do, we block it out, or we just don't take it to the heart. But I really don't. Somebody wants to write off the rebel flag on their truck or their car, and they don't know what it means. That's one thing I've found out. A lot of people don't know what it means. They think it means something to have to do with slavery. They think it means something to have to do with going around throwing eggs at black people's houses and all that stuff. I've heard that before. But that's not what the rebel flag means. If you look in your history books and really read on that flag, it has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with the color of anybody else's skin. It might on some people, but those are the people that are uneducated.
So during your lifetime, the rebel flag didn't really have that much effect on your life? It really wasn't a prominent
No, the only
issue.
thing, and my children never said anything about it. They got along fine here. It's just now that they're speaking up. When I say something to them about, you never come back to your class reunions, and they would make comments like we have no reason to. What did that school ever mean to us? And I'm thinking, well, it gave you an education. That's what it meant to you. But then they say, well, nothing around here means anything else. And I did ask my one daughter last week, and we were discussing that none of them come back to their class reunions. And she said, well, Mom, once you get around a lot of other African Americans, little towns like this don't mean anything to a bunch of whites. I didn't understand that, because I never ever lived any place but Mount Jackson. And I didn't understand that once you got to where more African Americans, where you tend to act the way they act, and you do what they do, and you have some kind of a difference about the white kids that you grew up with. And I was surprised to hear my daughter say that. And I had another daughter that came back here one time to visit, and I was teaching at Ashby Lee, and she stopped over there. And I tried to take her around and introduce to some of her teachers when she was little. She said, I didn't come back to see any of them. And I asked her, so why'd you get that attitude like that? She said, we don't worry about white people in Georgia. She was living in Georgia at the time. All that threw me off. That they really have a different attitude now about small towns and white people. And I can't change that. I brought them up right to take an interest in everybody, all cultures. So if they want to go a different route, that's what they have to do.
Um, have you ever witnessed or known about a misuse of the rebel flag toward African Americans? Have you ever like been around it or?
Several years ago, they had the, I guess it was the anniversary of the Confederate cemetery down there in Mount Jackson. And the same time, I had the grand opening of the historical colored cemetery in Mount Jackson. I don't know if any of you know where it is or not, but it's directly behind the Confederate cemetery. I'm not sure what happened. It was Mount Jackson Heritage Day, but I'm not sure what happened, but I think the word got around that I was gonna have this big thing at the college cemetery, because all of a sudden somebody decided to throw a big thing at the Confederate cemetery. Well, the night before this was gonna be held, on a Friday night, between Friday night at 12 and 5 o'clock Saturday morning, I didn't know anything about it until I went to the town hall Mount Jackson to prepare for this big day. And I was told that a bunch of Ku Klux Klan's flyers were thrown all around in town on the streets, and that they were put in people's yards. But mind you, some of you might find this amusing, but it isn't. Because somebody around here has something to do with Ku Klux Klan. Because somebody knows exactly where I live. They missed my yard. They put one in every single yard where I live, but they didn't put none in mine. So we do watch our neighbors. You have to watch your neighbor. Your best friend could be a Klansman. You don't know. And I really did get upset that day. And but we had a good time. The people that showed up at the Confederate cemetery showed up over at the Black Historical Cemetery. And I did find that upsetting about the rebel flag then, because I knew that Klansmen have a tie with the rebel flag.
Are there any questions anyone wants to ask? Or anything particular?
I wanted to just, if you could explain some of your educational background in terms of where you had to go to school before it was, you know, desegregated and stuff. Maybe you could explain a little bit how you had to travel and stuff.
Okay, and you know, I don't know how many of you kids live out 263, and your buses pass by the old Landis place out there, and it's a rebel flag hanging across 263. Mm-hmm. Have you ever noticed that? Mm-hmm. That really gets to me. I even have asked the town of Mount Jackson, and the guy's my best friend. He's a friend of mine. And I even asked him about it. He said, well, it doesn't mean anything to you guys. I said, but what do you think about people that's coming into Mount Jackson, going out to Bryce? That cuts down Bryce's reputation. When somebody comes here and they're blacks and they're from DC and New York, and they come through Mount Jackson and see that flag, that tells them that they don't want to come back here the next time. So that loses Bryce money. It loses the tourism in Mount Jackson. And his wife told me that she'd asked him to take it down, that it really didn't look appropriate, being over a main road going out to a resort. But anyway, I think he thinks that sometimes people try to find themselves. They find themselves in that, they find themselves in gangs, they find themselves in anything, but I find myself in me. Anyway, getting back to my education. When we were little, we grew up here in Mount Jackson. We played with white kids all our life. We didn't never even see black people. We didn't even know ourselves what they looked like. We thought we were white because we were always around one. It was like 13 families where I lived, and we were the only black family. So then when it was time for us to venture out to go to school, like they didn't have kindergarten, it was like first grade. We were put on a Greyhound bus. See, we didn't understand this. You guys would never, ever have to go back to this. Thanks to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and all the other guys. But we were taken over on Main Street in Mount Jackson, right where the art group is now. There used to be a drugstore. And we would stand in front of this drugstore because the pharmacist wouldn't allow us to stand inside. And we would wait for a Greyhound bus to come through Mount Jackson before we go to school. It might come at 9 o'clock, it might come at 10. Maybe it came at 12. We make it to Woodstock, to grade school, and then the next Greyhound bus might be going back up at 2. You have to go uptown on Main Street in front of Walton Snoop Drugstore. You know where that is now? It's right across from the new courthouse in Woodstock. We will walk up there and wait for another Greyhound bus to carry us back to Mount Jackson and New Market. There were some black kids in New Market. And we did this up through 7th grade. Well, when you got to 7th grade, you either had to stay home, or your parents had to find you a way to get to high school. So a lot of the high school kids, my older sisters, they were boarded out of town, or either our relatives took them to another state, and they got an education in another state. My oldest sister got her education in Connecticut, because she went there. You were sent away to get an education, because there was no bus, or nobody wanted to drive us to Harrisonburg. So then my other sister was boarded in Harrisonburg. My father had to pay room and board for her to go to Harrisonburg. And then some of the kids in Winchester, I know one girl went to Falls Church with an aunt. One girl went to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia with a cousin. And you guys go to school, just get in your cars and come right down here to school. And we didn't have that privilege. So then if it was too many kids in the family, like there was a lot of us. If my oldest sister, daddy paid room and board for her up there. My father was only making $35 a week at the Valley Fertilizer plant that's still standing today down there in Mount Jackson. He couldn't afford for me and my brother, which were the next two, so we stayed home. We were like 14 years old. 14, 15 years old, we were sitting at home. You guys were young, you guys sitting at home, you were 14. You just went on from Ashby, Norfolk, right here to Stonewall. So finally, my mom and my father didn't like it. So they went to the school board office in Shenandoah County. That's what gets us, is all those years they ran the same label that they have on their buses now, Shenandoah County Public Schools. They were not public, because if they were public, we would have had an education. So in a way, family, my mother, my father, and my aunt and my uncle, we were the only two families in Mount Jackson. They got together and they thought, well, we're going down and talk to the superintendent and find out, can they get us, our children, an education, some way to get to Harrisonburg, and let the county pay it, since they were paying county taxes. Well, they went down and talked to, at that time it was a last name by Hilton, and he said, well, we'll see what we can get, as you all can get somebody from a family to drive, because when no white person drive a black child to school. So my mother said, well, I'll drive my children and my nephews and nieces. So they gave her some kind of a car, 1955 something, that's me. But I have all that in here for my other programs that I go to. So my mother drove, piled people in that car. You didn't have to have seatbelts, so it was like 6 or 9 in the back and 3 or 4 in the front, and the driver squashed in there. As long as you got up around 11, they didn't have 81 at the time. So my mother would pile everybody in the car. Still, the older people still lived in Harrisonburg, like my older sister. So my father paid some lady to let her have a room there up until Fridays, Mondays through Friday. So then after the car, we started getting more and more children in the car. Then they gave my mother a little truck. You guys see these little FedEx trucks that run around, these little potato chip trucks that run around like you have a salesman in it. They gave us one of those. So be glad that you have a bus with windows, because if you've ever ridden in the back of one of those little potato chip buses, all they got is the driver has a window and the passenger has a window, and at the back, at that time you had nothing. So you were squashed in there with no air or anything. So we drove in that for a long, long time, and then my mother took ill and we didn't have a driver, so we were out of school again. We didn't have substitutes. If my mother got sick and she didn't drive us to school, we had days that we missed. So, and if Rockingham County went to school and Shenandoah County was not in school, we still had to go. So when I came to Stonewall, I had 35 credits, but I wasn't allowed to go out and work. I had to sit here all day long in study hall and help teach other kids. So in a way, a couple years later, my mother never ever got able to go back to drive. So then my cousins from Harrisonburg, he drove us. He came all the way out of Harrisonburg every day and picked us up, took us back, and he went back to Harrisonburg. Then after he got married, there wasn't anybody to drive us again, and Mrs. Jewel Hurst, Jeff's grandmother, she was German, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
Real nice lady. She came down to my parents' house and she said, I heard about these children not being able to get a good education. She said, and I know what it's like. She said, when I first came here from Germany, the whites didn't accept me. They weren't really nice to me, so I know what it's like for you all to have brown skin and not want to be accepted, not want to have an education or be given one. So she volunteered, she went down to the school board office and volunteered to drive the black children to Harrisonburg to get an education, which was a lot better. We got to school on time. We got, on days that we at the Harrisonburg didn't have to go, we didn't have to go either because we lived in Shenandoah County rather than us going because it was chaos. In a way, it worked out real fine, but his grandmother had a lot of people that hated her for doing that. A lot of people just resented her for carrying us to Rockingham County to get an education. And she had a lot of people that said things to her, and I'm not going to explain, I'm not going to go into the words, but you probably know if you watch some of the shows on TV, the shows about racism back in the 50, 20, and 30 years ago. And she did it diligently until they put a law in Virginia that says we need to desegregate the schools. And then my senior year at CM School, which I didn't want to leave because I'm going to tell you, I don't have anything against white schools, but we were really educated in a black school. You learned. You went to school. When you walked in that school door, that's where you went. You didn't take up a teacher's time. And you were told, you don't take my time up because I have something else I can do with my time. I have other kids I can teach. Get out of my classroom. And you didn't go home, oh, Mom, he kicked me out of the classroom. And Mom go down, you don't kick my child out. And parents got together with teachers and talked things over and listened to teachers. Didn't take up for their child, didn't take up for the teacher, but put things in perspective and look and listen. And we got along fine in school, I tell you. I had a better education at Lucy F. Sims School than I did when I came here my last year. When I came here my last year, it was chaos. I had a teacher that, it was an algebra class, in algebra theory, I think. Never would call on me. He was the only one that wasn't good to us. Had us in the back of the classroom, at the last row back against the wall. You could sit there all day long and he would not see you sitting there. You had to walk in front of him and put your hands up in his face to tell him that you knew the answer to a problem. So one day, I just kept holding my hand up and he said, well, by law, I guess I gotta let you answer. By law. I'll never ever forget that. I hear it all the time in the back of my mind. That never stopped me from continuing my education. And then when I got my education and I started doing some teaching at Newmarket Middle School and Ashby, never ever have I disrespected a child because I knew what it was like when I was coming up, how they disrespected us.
I would just like to say too, Ms. Warr, thank you first off for coming and speaking to us. But the biggest thing is that Mr. and Mrs. Warr, you heard some of the hardships that she just went through and stuff growing up and everything. They have always been such wonderful people to the community of Mount Jackson. And as a kid who grew up in Dutch Lane, I will tell you that you always felt like you had somebody there that was, looking out for you. And I know I felt that myself. So I just wanted to thank you for everything that you've done for the students here in Shenandoah County and everything else, working at Ashby and Newmarket Middle and everything else. And this is awesome, by the way. You did a great job.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I ran into a student, I think he's 20 years old, in Walmart last night, and he came up and gave me a big hug and told me he's never going to forget me from Ashby. And I've had kids that's 30 years old that told me that they told their children, if you had Mrs. Warr, she was one that cared about you. Because I had a man that tell me one time, he's 43 years old, and he says, when I got to Stonewall, nobody took interest in me, and I quit. He said, but I took interest in children because I knew there wasn't anybody but his grandmother that took interest in us.
Well, you've done a wonderful thing. We thank you a lot for being here today. We really
Thank you
appreciate
all.
it. Wasn't too bad, was it?
Nope.